My name is Michael, and I was just 8 years old when my life came to an end. That day, it seemed like the entire universe had conspired to create a farewell scenario, a kind of silent and solemn ritual that I wasn't prepared to face. I was lying in a cold hospital bed, the white sheets contrasting with the machines that pulsed around me, like silent guardians of my fragile existence. The air was filled with a sterile, antiseptic smell, and the rhythmic sound of medical equipment was the only thing that filled the oppressive silence of the room. My mother was by my side, her presence a safe haven amid the sea of uncertainty that surrounded me. She held my hand with an almost desperate strength, as if she feared that if she let go I would disappear forever. Her silent tears ran down her tired face, each drop a testament to the pain and despair she felt. The pain in his eyes was palpable, a reflection of my own anguish. She was my world, my tireless protector, but there was something she didn't know, something I carried in silence. As I looked at her, I felt a growing weakness taking over my body. Every breath was a battle, every sigh a painful achievement. The air felt heavier, harder to pull into my fragile lungs. I felt like my time was running out, like sand slipping through my fingers. But there was a dark truth I needed to reveal before I left, a secret that weighed heavy on my heart and that I somehow knew I couldn't take with me to the other side. I looked at the doctor, Dr. Anderson, a man who, despite his calm, professional appearance, had eyes that shone with deep compassion and restrained sadness. He always treated me kindly, as if he knew time was our implacable enemy. His eyes met mine, and at that moment, I decided it was time to tell him everything. I needed him to know, to understand the nightmare my mother and I were living in silence. My mind was filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I knew that by revealing my secret, I was putting everything I knew at risk. But the idea of leaving this world without telling the truth was unbearable. I felt that, in some way, my silence had been a prison, and now, at death's door, I needed to find the freedom that had always been denied me. The pain of keeping this secret was like a slowly spreading poison, eating away at my soul. "Dr. Anderson," I whispered. My voice was weak and barely audible, like the breath of a candle about to go out. "I need to tell you something before I go. Something very important." The doctor leaned closer, his expression of compassion turning to intense concern. He held my hand gently, his presence a comfort amid the storm of emotions that consumed me. I felt the light pressure of his hand, a gesture of support that gave me strength to move forward. "Michael, what is it? You can tell me. I'm here to help," he said, his voice a quiet murmur that seemed to pierce the barrier of my fear. I took a deep breath, feeling the agony of each inhale, and began to tell him about the nightmare unfolding in our house. My voice was shaking, but every word I managed to utter was a relief to my tortured soul. I knew I was finally breaking the cycle of silence and suffering that had imprisoned us for so long. "Dr. Anderson," I whispered, my voice a fragile whisper that was lost amid the beeping and whirring of the machines monitoring my life in its final moments. The atmosphere was filled with palpable tension, as if even the cold white walls of the hospital were silently awaiting what was to come. "I need to tell you something before I go. Something very important." The doctor approached, his expression turning from calm compassion to intense concern that seemed to light up his blue eyes. He held my hand gently, a gesture that seemed to say more than words could express. The light, comforting pressure of his hand was like an anchor that tethered me to reality, giving me the courage I needed to continue. I knew that by sharing my secret I was breaking a pact of silence that I had kept for so long, but I felt that this was the only chance to free my mother and me from the nightmare unfolding in our home. "Michael, what is it? You can tell me. I'm here to help," he said, his voice low and calm, filled with a gentleness that seemed to envelope my tired heart. His eyes fixed on mine were like windows into a hope I had forgotten existed. I took a deep breath, feeling the pain pierce my lungs, and tried to find the words that could describe the hell that my mother and I lived through daily. "My stepfather, he does bad things to my mother. Really bad things," I began, each word a tremendous effort, as if each syllable was a barrier I needed to cross. "She cries a lot and is hurt. And he always says that if I tell anyone, it will hurt us even more." The words came out with difficulty, a thread of voice that seemed to almost disappear into thin air. Each sentence was a battle against the fear that had silenced me for so long, but I knew I needed to tell it, that the truth needed to be told. Dr. Anderson's eyes widened in shock and horror at my words, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He squeezed my hand a little tighter, a gesture that gave me the courage I needed to continue. I could see the compassion in his eyes, mixed with a fierce determination to do something to help. It was a look that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, that perhaps there was a way out of the terror my mother and I faced. I felt a tear run down my face, a mixture of relief and sadness that made me realize the depth of the pain I was carrying. The image of my mother, her bruised face and teary eyes, invaded my mind, a painful memory that reminded me why I was doing this. I knew that by telling the truth, I was breaking the cycle of fear and suffering that kept us trapped. I was taking a step that my mother, no matter how brave she was, couldn't take. Dr. Anderson remained silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of my revelation. I could see the wheels in his mind turning, formulating a plan to help us. He looked at me, with an expression of determination that gave me hope. "Michael, you did the right thing by telling me this. I'm going to call the police right now. We're going to make sure you and your mother stay safe." His words were like a balm to my wounded soul, a promise that finally someone was listening, someone was willing to help us. Dr. Anderson's eyes widened with the surprise and horror my words provoked. His expression, once calm and professional, now reflected deep shock, as if he had been struck by an invisible blow. He glanced quickly at my mother, who was sitting next to me, her mind lost in a whirlwind of painful thoughts, oblivious to what was happening. The weight of the secret I had kept for so long now hung heavy in the air, threatening to destroy the fragile veil of normalcy my mother and I tried to maintain. "Michael, you did well to tell me this," said Dr. Anderson, his voice firm but full of compassion. "I need to call the police. We're going to protect you and your mother." His words were like a key that opened the door to a prison where I had been confined for so long. I felt a momentary relief, a lightness that seemed almost foreign after so many years of constant fear. However, a part of me knew that my mother didn't want this secret to be revealed. She always said it was to protect us, that silence was our only weapon against the violence and despair that surrounded us. My mind was in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, a chaotic mix of fear, relief, and guilt. I knew that by telling me what was happening, I was breaking the promise of silence that my mother had made me swear. It was a pact we kept with the hope that one day everything would improve, that the nightmare would end on its own. But reality was a dark shadow that never lifted, and I could no longer carry the burden alone. I looked at my mother, who was still deep in her own thoughts. The shadows under her eyes and the marks she tried to hide with makeup told me stories of nights filled with fear and pain. I couldn't bear to see the suffering in her eyes, the bruises she covered with long clothes and lame excuses. Each mark was a scar on my soul, a painful reminder of what we were facing. I knew that by revealing our secret I was risking everything, but I also knew there was no other option. The truth was a crushing weight that needed to be shared so that the light could finally enter our lives. I felt deep sadness for what this meant for my mother, for the pain I knew my confession would bring her. But I could no longer allow fear to be our constant companion, a ghost that haunted every moment of our lives. Every second that passed seemed like an eternity, a prolonged moment of uncertainty and tension. I knew that in making this decision, I was facing not only my own fear, but also the resistance of my mother, who had always believed that silence was our only protection. It was a painful dilemma, a choice between loyalty to my mother and the desperate need to free her from the terror that imprisoned us. Dr. Anderson looked at me with an expression of unwavering determination, a reflection of my own resolve to end the cycle of violence and fear. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you stay safe," he said, his voice firm and full of purpose. His words gave me a spark of hope, a promise that, finally, someone was willing to fight for us, to help us find a way out of the hell we were living through. And with that, I felt the weight of the secret I had carried for so long begin to lift, a little at a time, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning. It didn't take long for the police to arrive at the hospital. The sound of quick footsteps in the hallway, followed by the murmur of worried voices, echoed closer and closer. My mother, who until then had been immersed in her own thoughts, looked up with a mixture of fear and surprise. His eyes, big and wide, looked at me as if looking for an explanation, an understanding of what was about to happen. "Michael, what did you do?" she asked, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. I couldn't respond. Guilt and fear suffocated me, like a thick cloud that enveloped me, but deep down, I knew I had done the right thing. I could feel that the truth, as painful as it was about to emerge. Two police officers entered the room, their expressions a mix of seriousness and concern, as if they were carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. They were dressed in dark uniforms, their insignia shining in the cold hospital light. Their presence was imposing, but there was also an aura of empathy in their gaze, a silent promise of protection. "We received an emergency call. Has anyone here reported domestic abuse?" asked one of them, his voice firm, but without forgetting kindness. His eyes looked straight at my mother, who was sitting next to me, now visibly shaken. It was as if each word had the power to open an old wound, a secret she had fought so hard to keep hidden. My mother tried to compose herself, her hands shaking as she searched for the right words to deny the inevitable. His voice cracked as he tried to form a convincing response. Each word seemed stuck in his throat. I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and full of fear. It was a desperate attempt to protect herself, to protect me. But the police officer's eyes didn't look away, weren't fooled by the mask of normality she was trying to maintain. They knew there was more to the story, that the truth was hidden behind a curtain of terror and silence. I watched everything in resigned silence, unable to intervene, but feeling the tension building like a wave about to break. The silence that followed my mother's denial was heavy, loaded with unspoken implications and unconfessed fears. He knew that, despite his efforts to hide the truth, nothing could stop it from being revealed now. The truth was an unrelenting force, a tide that, once unleashed, could not be contained. The police officers exchanged meaningful glances, as if they were silently communicating something to each other. One of them approached my mother, his voice soft but firm. "Ma'am, we know this situation is difficult, but we are here to help. Please trust us." His voice had a tone of authority, but also compassion, as if he understood the weight of the secret she carried. My mother looked at him, her eyes filled with tears that she was fighting to hold back. It was as if the dam holding back her pain was about to break, and she knew she could no longer keep the secret. I looked at the police officers, my heart beating wildly, waiting for the moment when my mother would finally give in to the pressure of the truth. I knew that the confession she feared was about to happen, that the silence that had held us captive was about to be broken. I felt a mixture of relief and fear, a whirlwind of emotions that left me breathless. The police, with their imposing presence, were now the bearers of truth, the agents who would bring to light the dark secrets that had haunted our lives. My mother finally let out a choked sob, her resistance crumbling in the face of the inevitability of the truth. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible, broken by the weight of the pain she carried. "It's true. My son told you because he couldn't stand to see what was happening anymore. I tried to hide it, but I can't anymore. He hurts us, my husband. He hurts us." The words came out of his mouth like a flood, a stream of confessions that could no longer be contained. And in that moment, I knew that our lives would never be the same, that the secret we had been keeping was finally exposed to the light, and the help we needed was finally on the way. As the officers tried to get answers from my mother, I began to feel a growing weakness, as if what little energy I had left was being drained from my body. Their words sounded distant, like an echo reverberating in an endless tunnel. Each sentence was an effort, an attempt to pierce the wall of silence and fear that my mother had erected around our lives. I could hear the conversation in the distance, the officers' voices filled with a mix of urgency and compassion as they tried to convince her to tell the truth. She cried and denied, trying desperately to maintain the facade she had built to protect me and herself. But I knew the truth was there, on the verge of exploding, like a storm about to break its bonds. Dr. Anderson approached me again, his eyes reflecting deep sadness and sincere concern. He placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that brought me a little comfort amid the chaos that surrounded me. "You were very brave, Michael," he said, his voice soft but carrying a gravity that I could feel in every word. "Now we need to make sure your mother stays safe." His words were like a balm to my anguished heart, a promise that there was hope, that something good could come out of the nightmare we were living. The police officers continued to pressure my mother, their voices now a little firmer, but without losing their tone of empathy and understanding. Each word felt like a step closer to the truth, an effort to break through the wall of fear my mother had built around herself. The pressure was palpable, a weight that intensified by the second. Finally, the wall she had built began to crumble. She broke down in tears, her resistance finally broken by the desperate need to release the burden she had been carrying for so long. "Yes, it's true," she admitted, her voice a whisper broken by the tears that were now flowing freely down her face. Every word was filled with deep pain, a silent scream of despair that had finally found a way out. "He hurts us, and I was so scared I could never ask for help." His words were like a release, a flood of pent-up emotions spilling out with uncontrollable force. The room, once filled with tension, was now filled with an overwhelming sadness, a sense of loss and despair that seemed to consume everything around it. The police officers, upon hearing her confession, mobilized immediately, their faces reflecting their seriousness and determination to protect my mother from any future suffering. "We're going to make sure you and your son stay safe," one of them said, his voice firm but full of empathy. They started asking detailed questions, writing down every word, every detail my mother shared. I could see the pain in her eyes as she relived each moment of terror, but I could also see a glimmer of hope, a light that indicated that, finally, the help she so desperately needed was on the way. As my mother spoke, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The burden of our secret had finally been released, but the price we paid was high. I knew that, despite everything, we had made the right decision, that by revealing the truth, we were taking the first step toward healing and safety. Dr. Anderson remained by my side, his presence a beacon of calm amid the emotional storm unfolding around us. He held my hand firmly, his gaze filled with a silent promise that he would do everything in his power to ensure that my mother and I were protected. And so, as the police continued their work, I felt a new sense of hope rise within me. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and pain, but I also knew that we were no longer alone. We had finally found the courage to speak the truth, to break the cycle of fear and violence that imprisoned us. And with that, I knew that, somehow, we were one step closer to a future where peace and security were not just a distant dream, but a possible reality. With my mother's confession, the police officers began asking detailed questions. Their expressions were serious, and the empathy in their eyes reflected the gravity of the situation. Each question felt like an attempt to peel back the layers of horror that enveloped our lives, to understand the true extent of the abuse we had suffered. My mother, with her shoulders slumped and her voice shaking, began to talk about the nights of terror that unfolded in our house. There were muffled screams, constant threats, she said. Each word was a blow to me, a stab at my already fragile and tired heart. The details she shared were like shards of a reality I was desperately trying to forget. Each description was a new pain that added to my suffering. "He hits me, humiliates me," she continued, her voice a broken whisper, each word filled with a deep pain that she had kept hidden for so long. "And he always says that if I try to leave, he'll find us and hurt us even more." His words came out in a torrent of pain and suffering, a catharsis of years of fear and violence that finally found a way out. Dr. Anderson was at my side, his hand holding mine tightly, trying to keep me conscious and present in the moment. I could see the worry in his eyes, the deep sadness he shared with me. I knew my strength was fading quickly, like sand slipping through my fingers. Every breath was a struggle, every beat of my heart a reminder that my time was running out. But I needed to hold on. I needed to see my mother finally receive the help she so desperately needed. The police officers, with their serious and determined expressions, wrote down every detail, their pens running across the paper as my mother told her story. I was so scared, she confessed, her tears streaming down her face in a steady stream, afraid that if I told anyone, they would do something even worse. His voice was full of desperation, a confession of years of fear and submission that was now being exposed to the light. As my mother spoke, I could feel the weight of the truth she carried, the depth of the suffering she had hidden for so long. It was as if each word was a blade that cut through the lies and silence, revealing the brutality of our daily lives. He threatened us constantly, she said, her voice becoming a little firmer, a reflection of her determination to finally break the cycle of abuse. He said that if we tried to escape, he would find us and do something even worse. The officers continued to ask questions, their expressions serious and focused, as if they were trying to piece together a dark puzzle. Every detail my mother provided felt like a vital piece of the story, a part of the horror they needed to understand to truly help us. I knew it was coming to an end, my strength fading with each passing second, but I also knew that, finally, my mother was getting the help she needed. The room was immersed in a heavy silence, interrupted only by the sound of the police officers' voices and my mother's soft crying. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness, an understanding that even though I was about to leave, my mother was now safe, surrounded by people who could protect her. Dr. Anderson remained by my side, his presence a constant comfort amidst the chaos. And with that, I knew that despite everything, we had finally found the hope we so desperately needed, that the horror that surrounded us was beginning to lift, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning. With the police now involved, a sense of relief began to wash over me, although it was intertwined with a deep sadness that seemed to weigh heavily on my chest. I knew that my mother would be in good hands, that she would finally have the protection she deserved after so long of suffering. The hospital room, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now seemed like a refuge where hope was beginning to blossom. However, I could feel that my connection to the world around me was weakening, as if I was slowly drifting away, leaving behind the pains and worries that had haunted me for so long. Dr. Anderson, realizing the severity of my condition, moved quickly, calling for a nurse with a tone of urgency I had never heard before. "We're losing him," I heard him say, his voice filled with worry and a sadness that seemed to cut through the air. His sentence was like a call that resonated in my heart, a confirmation of what I already felt inside. Every beat of my heart felt like a silent goodbye, a goodbye to the life I knew. My mother, her face pale and her eyes full of fear, ran to my bed, her body shaking with the intensity of the emotions that consumed her. She held my hand tightly, as if her very life depended on it, her tears falling onto my face like little drops of pain and love mixed together. "Michael, stay with me, please," she begged, her voice a cry full of desperation and sadness that seemed to echo through the hospital hallways. Her words were like a desperate plea to the universe, a plea for me not to leave her alone in a world that had proven so cruel. "I promise we'll be okay, that I'll protect you," she said, her voice a ray of hope amid the storm of emotions. Every word was a comfort, a reminder that, despite everything, she was always by my side, fighting to protect me from the evil that surrounded us. But I knew it was too late for me. I felt a gentle warmth surrounding me, a sense of peace that I had never felt before. It was as if a veil of tranquility was being drawn over me, offering me the rest I had longed for. I looked at my mother, trying to convey to her all the love and gratitude I felt. His eyes, full of pain and love, met mine, and in that moment, I felt a connection that transcended time and space. "I love you, Mommy. Take care of yourself," I whispered, my words a soft echo amidst the chaos, a loving goodbye and a promise that, somehow, I would always be by her side. My voice was weak, but it carried all the strength of my heart, a last gesture of love that I wanted her to remember forever. As my words floated in the air, I felt my mind begin to drift away, like a boat breaking away from the shore and heading slowly towards the horizon. The pain that had consumed me for so long was fading, replaced by a serenity that enveloped me like a warm blanket on a cold night. My vision began to darken, The shapes around me became indistinct blurs, but my mother's face remained clear, a beacon of love that guided me through the darkness. And so, with one last breath of gratitude and peace, I left this world, knowing that I had done everything I could to protect my mother. My heart was at peace, and as darkness enveloped me, I knew my mother would be safe, surrounded by people who could help her find the happiness and peace she so deserved. With my last strength, I gathered all the energy that remained in my tired body and squeezed my mother's hand, trying to convey to her all the love and courage that I had found in that final moment. His touch was a vital link, a channel of communication that went beyond words, beyond pain and suffering. "I love you, Mommy," I murmured. My voice was weak, a whisper that barely managed to break the heavy silence in the room. "Take care." Each word carried a part of my heart, a silent promise that even in my absence, my love for her would remain an eternal, indestructible force. As I looked at my mother, I could see the pain and determination in her eyes, a complex mix of emotions that reflected my own hope that she would finally find the peace and security she deserved. Her eyes, bright with unshed tears, showed a quiet strength I've always admired, an ability to weather the fiercest storms with unwavering resilience. I felt relieved knowing that she would be protected, that the nightmare that tormented us would finally come to an end, and that she could start a new life, free from the shadows that haunted us so much. The last thing I felt was the warmth of her hand holding mine, a simple gesture but filled with love, a bond that would transcend time and space. It was a touch that promised continuity, that even in my absence, our love would remain alive and pulsating. And then, everything went dark, a darkness that wasn't scary but warm and comforting. It was like being enveloped in a soft embrace, a return to the primal peace from which we all came. I knew I was going to a better place, a place where there would be no more pain or fear, where I could rest in a tranquility I had never known in my life. As the darkness enveloped me, I felt a deep serenity, a certainty that my departure was a necessary step, a transition to something bigger and more beautiful. I left this world knowing that my mother would be safe, surrounded by those who could help her rebuild her life. And for me, that was the only thing that mattered. The knowledge that she would be protected and that she could finally live in peace gave me a sense of completeness, a certainty that my brief time in this world had fulfilled its purpose. The pain and fear that had been my constant companions now dissolved into a serene tranquility. I was at peace, knowing that despite everything, my mother had the strength and support she needed to move forward. My last thought was a silent prayer that she would find the happiness and security she always deserved, a promise that somehow I would always be by her side, guiding and protecting her, even from a distance. And so, with a final sigh of relief and gratitude, I left this world, feeling a deep peace and an unshakable certainty that the love we shared was eternal, a beacon that would guide my mother to the light and happiness we so desperately sought. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for my mother, roller coaster of pain, relief, and uncertainty. The police, acting with a speed that seemed almost unthinkable to someone accustomed to the slow pace of suffering, took my stepfather into custody. He was accused of abuse and assault, and the evidence of his monstrous behavior was enough to ensure he wouldn't walk free anytime soon. Our house, which had once been a place of terror and pain, was now empty, a silent witness to the atrocities that had occurred there. The walls that once echoed screams and cries were now silent, a silence that spoke louder than any sound. My mother was taken to a shelter, a safe place where she could begin to rebuild her life away from the shadows of fear and violence. The shelter, with its pale walls and welcoming rooms, was a refuge of hope, a space where she could breathe without the constant weight of threat. It was a place where the scars, both physical and emotional, could begin to heal, and where she could finally find the peace she had longed for. Each day was a new beginning, an opportunity to leave behind the nightmare she had lived for so long. Dr. Anderson and the police officers continued to visit my mother regularly, offering not only physical support but also a shoulder to lean on, someone she could count on. They made sure she was protected by closely monitoring any attempts at contact from my stepfather or anyone else who might pose a threat. Their constant presence was a reminder that my mother was no longer alone, that there were people willing to fight for her, to ensure that her life would never be marked by terror again. They promised they would do everything they could to make sure she never had to go through what she did again, that the cycle of abuse and fear that had defined so much of her life had finally been broken. Their promise was an anchor of hope, a commitment that justice was not just a word but a concrete and necessary action. Each visit, each word of support, was a step in the healing process, an affirmation that she deserved better, that there was a better future waiting for her. My mother, although devastated by the loss of her son, began to find the strength to move on. She still cried for me, but each tear was also a drop of relief, a confirmation that my sacrifice had not been in vain. The pain of loss was deep, but I knew I was at peace, and that certainty was the light that guided her through the darkness of grief. My last goodbye and my promise of eternal love were the fuel she needed to keep going, an invisible force that pushed her forward. She started joining support groups, building new friendships with people who understood her pain and struggle. Every conversation, every hug, was a step toward recovery, a movement toward a life where the shadow of fear no longer dominated its horizon. I knew the road to healing would be long and full of challenges, but I also knew she had the strength and resilience to overcome each obstacle. As she began to rebuild her life, the memories of our shared history became the foundation on which she could build a better future. The house that was once a place of terror was now only in her past, a distant memory that she was determined to leave behind. And so, with justice finally served, my mother could begin to look to the future with hope, knowing that despite everything, there was a new life waiting for her, a life where peace and security were not just a dream, but a reality within your reach. My mother, little by little, began to rebuild her life. Each step was a journey of courage and determination. With the tireless help of Dr. Anderson and the police officers who did so much for her, she found a new place to live, far from the shadows and horrors that previously haunted her. It was a modest house, but full of light and warmth, a refuge where she could begin to let go of the past and focus on the future. The bright walls and welcoming atmosphere were a sharp contrast to where we had come from, a symbol of rebirth and hope. Each day that passed was a steady step toward healing, a courageous move toward a future where peace and security were not only possible, but tangible. My mother began to get involved in the local community, participating in support groups and social events that helped build a new network of friends and allies. She found strength in simple activities like gardening and crafts, which gave her a sense of control and accomplishment. The pain of my loss was a constant presence in her life, a void that would never be filled, but she knew she had to move on, both for me and for herself. The promise I made to her that she would be okay and take care of herself was a guiding light on her healing journey. Every moment of weakness was met with the memory of my words, a reminder that her suffering was not in vain, and that I would always be with her in spirit. With this renewed strength, she began to look to the future with more hope, seeing not only the challenges but also the opportunities for happiness and growth. She dedicated herself to creating a home where the memory of our love could flourish in an environment of peace and security. Regular visits from Dr. Anderson and the police officers were not only a way to ensure her protection, but also a constant source of emotional support. They became friends and confidants, a chosen family that helped fill the void left by my departure. Over time, my mother learned to smile again, to find joy in the little things in life, like the sound of the birds in the garden or the warmth of the sun on her face. Every smile, every moment of joy was a victory, proof of her resilience and determination to live a full and meaningful life. She also began to get involved in causes that helped others in similar situations, using her own experience of pain and recovery as a way to inspire and support those who were still struggling. His story of overcoming became a beacon of hope for many, showing that even in the darkest circumstances, the possibility of a new beginning always existed. With every act of kindness and every word of encouragement, she was building a legacy of love and compassion that reflected the best of both of us. In our new home, my mother created a sanctuary for me, a special corner where she could remember me with love and longing, but also with the knowledge that I was at peace. It was a place where she could connect with me in a deep and meaningful way, finding solace in the happy memories we shared and the knowledge that, somehow, I was still there for her. This sanctuary became a source of strength, a place where she could renew her determination to live a life full of purpose and joy. And so, as time passed, my mother began to embrace the new beginning she so deserved. She knew that the road to healing was long and full of challenges, but she was ready to face them with courage and determination. The promise I made to her that she would be okay and take care of herself continued to guide her, a constant light on her journey. And with every step she took, she was building a life where peace, security, and happiness were not just dreams, but a tangible and achievable reality.